Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Thompson, Head of External Affairs for APM, and you're all very welcome. I'm going to host the webinar today, so big welcome to not only APM members and those in the project management community, but also to people outside our profession who are joining us today. I'm going to give a little introduction for a couple of minutes, just a little bit for context. The subject today is around our Projecting the Future campaign. This is a piece of thought leadership work that we kicked off about July last year. It was launched at our Manchester conference and a webinar that accompanied the piece of research we did. Some of you will know a lot about this, others nothing at all. So we're going to just do a little bit of context. Essentially, there are main two strands to this. Firstly, what do we need to do as a project profession to ensure we are fit for the future? And secondly, we're looking at 6 key themes that kind of might impact the wider environment and how our profession operates. So that's kind of the outline. Now, the 6 key themes, if you're not aware, each of them has been covered by a discussion paper. So it's the 4th Industrial Revolution, that's AI and tech. The impact of longevity, the 100-year life, climate change, sustainability, smart cities and urbanization, mobility and transport, and finally the 6th paper, which was launched this Tuesday on skills and work. And at APM, we regard this as kind of the glue that pulls all the other 5 papers together. So our big objective really is to debate and discuss what we need to do collectively and as individuals to ensure the project profession can adapt and thrive and play a increasingly important part in delivering change and projects more successfully. So, as I said, we'll discuss the Future of Work and Skills paper. If you've had a chance to read it, great. If not, it's online. The debate, in a sense, starts now. Although this is probably the paper we've had most interactivity with and consultation already. So we've done a couple of sessions with fellows in December, couple of corporate events, including the one on the 3rd of March that some of you may have attended, and as well as lots of individual and other contributions. So this webinar is kind of the next stage in that consultation process. So hopefully we'll have everybody joined the webinar now and ready to go. So I'm going to go straight now into introductions. We've got 3 speakers today. First of all, Patrick Woodman, who's been helping us throughout on the Projecting the Future work. He's been lead author in all the 6 papers we've had. He was previously head of research and advocacy at the Chartered Management Institute, so he knows a lot about some of these issues. And he's currently editor of Dialogue magazine. Then after Patrick, we're going to have a well-known face to many at APM, Dr. Ian Clarkson, who's head of organizational consultancy at QA. Ian's already been active in this debate, so he presented in December and he's done a couple of blogs. He's a highly experienced consultant, author, trainer and speaker with over 20 years experience in project management, organizational change and learning. And finally, external speakers as such is Alice Tranter, who's Labour Market and Skills Policy Advisor at Make UK. She's going to help present an external view to our profession and reflect particularly on the challenge of digital skills. Prior to joining Make UK, Alice was a governess. So over to Patrick to kick off the seminar proper.
Good morning, everybody. Hope you can hear me loud and clear. Pleasure to be with so many of you this morning to talk about the future of work and skills. Not only, as the image might suggest, as it will affect our children, but also how it will affect us in the next 5 or 10 years. Within which time frame I think there is a huge amount of change on the way and plenty to chew over this morning. So I'm going to go through in the space of about 20 minutes 4 sections, looking first at the changes that are happening in the wider business environment and what we think are some of the most salient features of those changes, the implications of those changes for what we do in our jobs and how we work, looking at then what those changes imply for the skills that we in the project profession will need to thrive. And fourthly, thinking a little bit about how we learn. How can we prepare as individuals at an organizational level and perhaps start to think about a policy or societal level for the future. So that's the outline. So let's get started. And When it comes to the changing business environment, I think it really is defined by a sort of sense of turmoil and change, which underlies the environment that we are working in, irrespective of the current pandemic. And that comes across very strongly in a lot of business writing. I think it's the defining characteristic in many senses of a lot of the business press at the moment, whether it's the Harvard Business Review here looking at the role of AI on our organizations, The Economist digesting how the world economy is changing, where competition is coming from unexpected sources, what that means for business strategy, for the products and services we offer. Or in Dialogue, the magazine that I edit with Duke Corporate Education, as David mentioned, where we recently looked at the so-called second wave of digitization. Which, to summarize, if you put it this way, if you used to work for Blockbuster, digitization is old news. If you work for Eddie Stobart or the taxi firm Addison Lee, digitization is on the horizon and coming at you really very fast. So it's moving from through different industries. And that, of course, is all part of what we talk about as the fourth industrial revolution. It's the arrival of digital technology, cyber-physical systems, which bridge the gap between the physical and cyber worlds. Within that, people talk about lots of different aspects, be it the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, genome editing and health. There are incredible wide-ranging spheres of application, and we've touched on some of them in our 6 papers throughout the course of Projecting the Future. But that is the technology, the disruption to society and how we do things that is shaping this environment. And it plays out in some different ways. One is this. Some of you will be familiar with the notion of VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And if that isn't the very definition of the times we're living through, I'm not sure what is. The technologies that we are working with really help propagate that volatility, the network effects that help a cute kitten video or allow Joe Wicks to broadcast to thousands, if not millions of people every morning. Those same effects can make rather less appealing change happen incredibly quickly as well at scale. And so we face uncertainty and ambiguity. The question for APM, of course, and for all of us, is how the profession thrives in that sort of world. And another way of thinking about it is this, the Cynefin model, developed by the theorist Dave Snowden, which we present in the launch Projecting the Future paper. So I won't dwell on it too long here, but suffice to say that we are less and less finding ourselves working in the bottom right-hand domain of the obvious, more and more in complicated, complex, and even in chaotic situations. That means that what we need to do as professionals changes. No longer are we just applying best practice. We are developing emergent practice or perhaps novel practice. And I think the approach for that of under the chaotic domain in the bottom left, where you act because you don't have any other choice, you have to sense how that takes effect and you respond and you adapt. And for many of us, I think that feels resonant for where we are today. The point, I suppose, that I'm making with regards to this morning's webinar is that the skills needed to implement best practice in clear, obvious situations are very different to those needed to thrive when practice is emergent or novel. And this feeds into what we talk about in the new paper as the rise of the project society. Now, we know from APM's research published last year, the Golden Thread report, that the project sector delivers over 156 billion of gross value added to the UK economy alone, which is absolutely colossal. It has a huge reach throughout our economy. And the reason is that delivering change, because of this more complex, chaotic and VUCA world, delivering change for organizations now is superseding business as usual. And that means more projects. The rise of project-based teams and resourcing, more complex transformational projects. Projects are drawing in professionals of all backgrounds as well. So there's a real opportunity here actually for the project profession to step up and provide leadership. And that, I think, is kind of where Projecting the Future comes from. It's about how we recast the project profession as the change profession. So the implication is, if that's the big picture, how is work changing? Well, we've probably all experienced some changes in the last month or so, but I do start this section with a quote that we hold dearly across the Projecting the Future team from Bill Gates. It's a caveat to everything that we say, probably throughout this webinar, in fact. Prediction is a mug's game, but we can observe what's happening at the moment, what has been happening in recent years, and offer some thoughts about where it's all going. And actually, APM has been talking about this for quite some time as well. This graphic comes from a 2017 report published with UCL and Arup, and we expand on some of these themes in our new report out this week. Very briefly, it identifies these 7 themes around globalization and virtual teams. Of course, virtual teams are very current, but not new. So we see then changes in how organizations innovate and how their cultures are changing, the blurring of the boundaries between different organizations, more collaboration, more joint working, but also the blurring of the lines between organizations and their customers or the end users of our projects. We see increasing diversity. We talk a bit about multi-generational diversity, different aspects of diversity that are changing what it feels like to be at work and how we need to operate to better include people and create inclusive cultures. Fourth, here we see the rise of the gig economy. Of course, something that also is not new but has been brought to the fore in recent weeks. That has affected many professionals. It's not just delivery riders or Uber drivers. It feeds into how a lot of professionals work. And pertinent to the skills question, of course, is the question of who takes responsibility for learning and development for those in the gig economy. Fifth, we identified here the changes underway in corporate culture, and we talk in the new paper, for example, about the rise of purpose, a really powerful movement in business to redefine business away from the kind of classic Friedman model of only delivering stakeholder return, shareholder return, quarterly profits as being the only yardstick for measuring business success and the only moral obligation of business, to a much broader purpose that says, well, maybe that doesn't serve society as we want, and we need to go back to thinking about what our businesses are for. Sixth, automation and human-machine collaboration, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And seventh, something that I think was quite prescient, and again is a theme that we found was important from the conversations we had for our new paper around construction. We know that the current government has got a huge agenda around levelling up, and it's reaffirmed recently that it intends to stick to that as we kind of move forward beyond the current crisis. So how can the construction sector and infrastructure and government as a smart client better work to deliver the infrastructure change we need? Now, homing in on the technology side of things, we looked at this in an earlier paper, but briefly, there are some pretty eye-watering numbers about the potential implication of technology for our jobs. Eye-catching numbers like up to 800 million jobs globally being replaced over this decade. The Bank of England assessing that 35% of jobs in the UK currently are at high risk of replacement from technology. But one of the key things that we've observed is that it's not just about jobs. Jobs could be reconfigured, they're fluid, but it is about the tasks that we do. And actually, McKinsey estimate that as much as a quarter of what chief executives do today could already be automated with today's technology, which brings home a couple of things. Firstly, that this will apply to white-collar professionals, not just to, say, road hauliers or cashiers on shop desks. It will apply to professionals. And secondly, it raises the question about, if that's going to happen to your job, what is the 25% of what you do that could be automated, and what are you going to do with the rest of that time that is freed up? And that's the opportunity. And one of the things we found is, we love this piece of work from the RSA, which explains some of the different ways that technology affects work. The classic way of thinking about it, I suppose, is substitution. That's the example of driverless vehicles, where AI quite straightforwardly substitute for a task that has represented a person's job. But that's not the only way it affects. We have augmentation to think about. Smart glasses in medicine or manufacturing are a great example of that. They help us do things that are already being done by humans, and they're not necessarily likely to replace the human side of that, at least in the medium term. Then there's transference. One of the everyday examples of that is in supermarkets where we have self-serve checkouts. Work moves from one group to another. And there's work generation. The obvious example, I suppose, in technology is the rise of tech firms with coders and developers. But also the RSA has this fascinating example of fish management where AI technology can now spot within salmon stocks where fish are carrying disease. That creates new work, and it's a pretty left field example, but it's something that just wasn't possible, and there will be much more, many more examples of that in different fields as we go forward and as tech comes in. And that's why we see, besides the concerns about job losses, incredible upsides to technology in terms of productivity and advances, be it in medicine, productivity that will benefit the economy going forward. So this isn't all about threat by any stretch. Now, what does that mean for the project management profession? PwC have done some work on this and sketched out 4 different stages, which I'll briefly run through here. The first is about integration and automation. So the integration of systems is something that actually in our conversations, so many of the project community really respond to, and this resonates with. Getting project budget updates flowing through from databases to a forecast report, enabling auto scheduling. When we held the APM Corporate Partners Forum back at the start of March, a discussion question there, actually, we highlighted scheduling, report generation, document management, automated follow-up of work. Those were the areas that people thought were most ripe for automation and that they would like to see automated. So I guess the question here is what you would want to automate, how could you do it, and then what would you do with the time? Beyond that, you've got chatbot assistance, something that PwC thinks will be big, helping perhaps with scheduling meetings or allocating and following up on work. Then you've got the much more sophisticated level of machine learning. Now, PwC expects this to be the most disruptive innovation in project management in the next decade. It would, for example, allow machine learning systems to offer guidance on how you might set up and steer a project given certain parameters, or recommend solutions to problems that arise. That's very complex, right? Because as we've said, we're looking at projects being increasingly sophisticated and transformational. It requires data analytics skills. We're some way probably from having that full-blown capability, but it clearly has huge potential. And the fourth level on the right, PwC, they sort of say, look, autonomous project management, that really is the rule of the robots, and humans fade somewhat sadly into the background, but that's not on the agenda in the near future. So this, I suppose, is the takeaway. What would you want to automate and how you work, how you would then use the time and resource saved, and therefore to ask what skills would you need to excel in that activity? Which brings me on to the third section here. Skills that will be most needed in the future. Now, looking generally at this, not just in terms of what relates to project profession, I'll kind of skip through this as we have it in the report, but we know that skills matter because they are a critical driver of performance, organizationally, nationally. They determine productivity, and yet, despite huge amounts of money being spent in the UK on skills, around a third of people have had no formal training in the last 5 years. So there are some real concerns about how that spending is distributed. And we've seen across lots of the analysis that we've looked at over the last few months, some consistent themes about the importance of sophisticated skills for the future of work. The World Economic Forum, who do a lot of work in this space, identify these 5 skills as being core to future success. And you see this real blend of creativity, originality, and initiative, very human skills, and complex problem solving, alongside technical skills like technology design and programming. And that's something that runs throughout, I think, what we've found throughout Projecting the Future, this kind of twin demand for technical and the human factor skills. It's visible in EY's top 5 skills as well. They emphasize creativity, emotional intelligence, something that comes out quite strongly in some of the work as well. The abilities to collaborate effectively, hugely important for project success. So how then will we learn and develop those sorts of skills if we're going to thrive and kind of stave off the threat of the robots for a little while yet? Well, Thomas Friedman in the New York Times sums up incredibly effectively. He says that if you want to be a lifelong employee anywhere, you have to be a lifelong learner, which means it's on you. Self-motivation to learn and keep learning becomes the most important life skill in his view. And that means we have to learn very differently. We highlighted in one of our papers the work of Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott, and they talk about breaking the lockstep between age and career stage, and that applies really fundamentally to how we learn. We've traditionally had a model of a linear path between learning, coming out of childhood into early adulthood, moving into work, working our way up, probably with some training, development, CPD, of course, as we go, and then retiring from the highest level that we attain in our careers. What some theorists expect is that we're going to see, and we already start to see, much more alternating phases of learning and working, switching between real learning, not just brushing up, but actually really going back and relearning core skills throughout a lifetime of CPD. There are questions that come with that, of course, not least where learning sits in the gig economy. And I think we do have to think now about the implications of the current crisis. We're entering a world where money will be in short supply, be it within businesses or the public services or in our own pockets. So how are we going to meet our needs for learning development in that new world? One fascinating example, briefly, that was shared at APM's Corporate Partner Forum in March was from PwC. Their New World, New Skills program is a vast multi-year program looking to help up the digital skills of their people. And it comes with this premise that Bob Moritz, their chairman, summed up, which is that they will not leave their people behind. They don't guarantee a specific job, but he does guarantee a future in the organization. And that speaks to, I think, this sense of uncertainty. None of us can predict clearly what will happen. Say it's a mug's game to try, but what they do have is a commitment to adapting. And really where we arrive in the new paper under Projecting the Future is this notion of the adaptive project professional, something that David has been advocating very strongly. It starts from the notion of the growth mindset that we need to shift as leaders from being know-it-all to learn-it-alls. And it brings together this blend of technical skills and the human factor. So this is going to be a hugely important idea, I think, for APM in the near term, influencing its CPD, its qualifications offer. It needs to feed, I think, also more broadly into policy support for investment in skills. And really, I guess, one of the questions that APM is going to want to know is what APM can do to help develop these adaptive project professionals fit to thrive in the future world. So to wrap up, these are the discussion questions that we frame in the paper, which we'd love you to be thinking about to assist in how you prepare yourself and your organizations, your projects for the future, and what we would like your feedback on. And David will run through at the end the different ways that you can contribute to the ongoing conversation today and beyond. But it really sums out gets to some of the themes that we've been talking about this morning, about how project work is changing, what the skills implications will be throughout careers, what your organization could do, could it use current projects better, who else might need to take action, what you think APM should do in the future to support you and other professionals. We do want to know, of course, if you think we've missed anything else that we need to be discussing. This certainly is the beginning of a conversation. It's not intended to be the final word on it, so do please tell us if we've missed anything else. And finally, one last question. What steps will you take to prepare for the future of work? So that's where I finish, and it's my pleasure to hand over now to Ian. Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. To set up my kind of next few minutes, really, you can see the statement on screen, the title, The Challenge for the Project Profession. I guess as it's written there, it's more of a statement, really, but I'd like to kind of reframe it a bit more as a question based on the base of this paper, kind of what is the challenge for our project profession. So what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes or so is just to step through what some research says, some recent research from the APM as well around what the challenges are for the project profession, and then look at kind of some wider research from some think tanks around what that is as well. So in terms of the challenge for our profession. These graphics here, you can just see in the bottom right corner the source of these graphics, the APM Salary and Market Trend Survey, which came out literally a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't already downloaded that or taken a look at it, please do go onto the APM website and have a look. These two images here, the top one, these are taken directly from the report, are all about the significant challenges that our profession faces. So the top image is looking at the significant challenges as a whole. The bottom image is looking at the most significant challenge according to respondents. And we can see here that in the top of both of these graphics, that developing skills needed for the future workplace comes out on top. Now, we're not saying that the others are not important. We're just saying that this is coming out as a kind of a really, really significant challenge, and the most significant challenge for our profession. So what I'm going to be starting to do is just to focus in on what these particular skills need to be. And I was just having a look through the questions that were coming through, and there was a really great question from Adrian, who said, you know, skills is kind of too ambiguous. It should be kind of capabilities, and thinking about kind of knowledge, skills and experience as well. And I do agree with that, actually. So, you know, using skills in a kind of bit more of a general term, it's a combination of kind of the knowledge that we need, the experience that we have as well. So I think we have a triple whammy facing us, really, when it comes to our profession. And this is kind of how I've tried to articulate what that triple whammy is. The first one is taken from the World Economic Forum Future Jobs Report 2016. I do admit that the first time I came across this was in an in-flight magazine. I then went on to kind of read it in full, but what it said was 65% of children entering primary school today will ultimately end up working in completely new job types that don't exist yet. So what that's saying is the future of work, there are professions that are going to be around that haven't been invented yet. And you don't have to go that far back, really, to think about some job types and some professions that didn't exist 5 years ago. You know, 3D printing didn't exist a number of years ago. We might argue that's a little bit kind of old-fashioned now, isn't it? You know, what does the future hold? How can our profession compete with technological professions or otherwise that haven't been invented yet? So that, for me, is the first one. How are we going to compete with what might be perceived as more exciting industries? Just for the record, by the way, I do think project management is very exciting. The second one is from a book by Yuval Noah Harari, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. If you haven't read that, he's also the author of Sapiens and Homo Deus, where he talks about the impact of technology. And he talks here about most people will not suffer from exploitation, but from something much worse, irrelevance. And this is kind of really linking into something Patrick was saying earlier around kind of what's the impact of technology, etc., on jobs. And Yuval Noah Harari is advocating that we're not worrying about being exploited by technology, but rather that will become irrelevant from it. So that, for me, is the second one. You know, will kind of technology take our jobs, if you like. Then the third one was just something I came across from Boston Consulting Group, and this third one is really a generational factor. Young talent today are motivated by different factors. They don't value long-term goals or titles. So what they're saying there is that, you know, the future generation are not necessarily motivated by titles. They're motivated by different things. And we can link this into things like employee value propositions of organizations. What does it mean to be an employee? Learning and development. There are different factors that motivate people in the workplace now. So when we think about kind of Generation Z and the next generation, which I believe is called Generation Alpha, how are we going to attract the next generation of project professionals into our industry? So challenging times ahead for our profession, if you like. So linking in with that, you can just see the source of this content here. It's the report by McKinsey, which talked about the UK workplace skill shortage by 2030. So looking at over the next 10 years or so. And you can just see here in the highlighted circle that the research says that we're predicting 5.5 million projected underskilled workers in project management over the next decade. So 5.5 million people needed in project management. Thinking back to what Patrick was saying about the contribution of project management to the UK economy, you know, is this kind of the real problem that we've got the triple whammy of generational factors, kind of technology taking our jobs, and jobs that don't exist yet, coupled with what could be a very big skill shortage. So for me, the big question then becomes, how are we going to fill this skill shortage and attract people into profession? That for me is kind of the challenge that we face. How are we going to fill this skill shortage and attract people into our profession? Because we know it's important, we know it's vital. And so going back to the APM Salary and Market Trend Survey, this is some of the future skills that that survey talked about, and we can see on here we've got kind of lots of different type of skills on there. And I guess my question to you all, and is there anything you think is missing? So, but we can see on there stakeholder engagement, we can see leadership, strategic management, planning and monitoring, etc. I can see some things coming through as well. Communications coming through very strongly. Disaster management, very timely, thank you. Change, transformational skills, emotional intelligence, sponsor management, emotional intelligence again, absolutely. I think, you know, again, picking up on some of the things that Patrick was saying about VUCA as well, I think there's things in there like agile skills are particularly important as well. I'm a big fan of things like innovation, entrepreneurship, that kind of mindset. So I think there's lots of different skills that are going to be needed by the future project professional, if you like. And so the question goes back to, how are we going to fill that 5.5 million skills gaps? And for me, there's a really interesting statement from the same McKinsey report, which again is a download. I think this is a wonderful statement, a really, really wonderful statement. Can we acquire talent from unconventional sources by focusing on the intrinsic qualities a person has rather than the sector from which those skills came from? And what it's saying is, rather than focusing on saying, can I be a project manager in a particular industry? Let's look toward that industry for that. What about some of the intrinsic qualities a person has? So linking back to your comments coming through about the skills, those kind of change management skills, the leadership skills, the benefits, the communication, the EI, all of those type of skills, they are intrinsic qualities that a person could have, which are industry independent. They kind of transcend, they cross in industry boundaries. And so at the bottom, you'll see also a link to a blog that I wrote, which is called Let's Flip Project Management on its head. And, you know, the title is, are you bold enough to flip it, to flip the consideration away from maybe focusing on the technical skills to focusing a bit more on what we might call the softer skills, the communication, and look to fill that skill shortage from more unconventional sources, focusing on the intrinsic qualities. I think that's quite an emotive statement. I think it's quite a disruptive statement, if I'm being honest with you, but I like it a lot. And so I guess my question to you, or my challenge to you all is, you know, in order to address the challenge that we have of generational factors, technology, fear of technology taking our jobs, etc., are we bold enough to flip it and look for those intrinsic qualities? So that kind of concludes my take on our challenge, if you like. So please do join the big conversation if you haven't already done so, and put your input and feedback and some contact details on there for me if you wish to as well. So thank you, and thank you for your input through the dialogue as well in answer to some of those questions.
I thought we'd just maybe kick off with some questions until Alice comes online. But I thought we'd just kick off with panelists to just talk about a very germane issue, which is the impact of COVID-19 and on some of the trends been talking about. I was wondering whether the panelists would just like to pick up on that very point. So if we can hear you, Patrick and Ian, do you want to come in on those points?
Clearly, it's kind of challenging times for us at the minute, isn't it, around kind of COVID-19. I do think, we need to kind of adjust and adapt. And I think, working more remotely, I think is a big thing for us as well. I think a lot of the time, kind of project management has maybe communication has been a lot more kind of face-to-face, or maybe been a bit more kind of in person through meetings. But actually, I think this situation is showing everybody that actually effective communication and linking in with some of those kind of key skills that were coming through in my bit can be done just as effectively remotely. And I think that will kind of change how we engage and interact on projects as well. Positively, I think it's a very positive thing. I think we're all going to need new skills to do that as well, and things like that. But I think that's a really positive shift. So I think out of this whole situation, I think we will see lots of positivity, certainly for our profession.
Patrick?
I think it's a fascinating question, and we've got kind of the short-term effects created by COVID-19 on how we're working now. And I think in some ways we'll get past the current phase. We will, fingers crossed, have some therapies, treatments, a kind of a solution in the medium term. The question after that, I think, is going to be much more structural about the state that the economy is in beyond that. What of our organizations, which of our organizations have survived and have got the money to do what they want to do? How is government going to finance some of the major projects that it wants to do? And we, are barely at the end of a decade in which government spending has been quite constrained, and people won't need reminded, I'm sure, of the discussions about austerity and notes at the Treasury saying there's no money left and that sort of thing. And yet we suddenly are faced with this colossal shock. And I think spending commitments already announced by government to support businesses and personal income already dwarf by some £40 billion what was committed to in the wake of the 2008 crash. So this is, I think, where, if you like, the real change will be felt. So for skills and development, it becomes, well, if this is a moment to radically reshape what organizations do, to work smarter, to adopt some of the technology, because what we've done has just fallen to pieces. So actually it opens up a moment of change. And I think that can be incredibly positive if we get it right. That's got to be the upside of this. But we will need to think very carefully, I think, kind of collectively, about how we fund the things that we want to do.
Yeah, and just to add into that as well, I think, the catalyst for change can come from many different places as well. The situation we're in at the minute is one catalyst for change. I think the key with any change, isn't it, is can we sustain it? Do we want to sustain it so we can all change and adapt to the situation? But will we continue to, kind of operate in this way that we're in now? If will it be sustained? Will we go back? And I think that's the same for our profession as well, isn't it? In the sense of saying, if we can continue to run projects in a different way based on this catalyst, will that be sustained, or will we revert back to our previous ways of working? I hope we can sustain it. I really do.
I'm just checking whether Alice is able to come in on this point. Alice, are you just? Can we hear you? No, afraid not. I don't know what's wrong, but we're not getting Alice coming on voice. So I was going to move on to another question, which is actually kind of related to COVID-19, but also, in the current, the current crisis, like previous recessions, quite often the first instinct of organisations is to cut their training budget, and I think that's a big concern, that organisations often turn the tap off just when it's most needed. I was just wondering, there was actually a point made by the, I think, Chief Executive of the Institute for Student Employers this morning about the danger of turning off the tap, and actually that in previous recessions firms have actually paid the price for doing that, and the smart firms carried on investing in their graduates and their apprentices. Patrick, Ian, any thoughts on that in terms of getting the balance? Because I think lots of people are at home and actually doing more training than ever, actually online training, webinars, qualifications. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll start. I think it's how organisations. I 100% agree. It's kind of now's the time to be looking at training, and I promise you, I'm not saying that coming from a training provider. It's but it is a case of taking the opportunity to invest, and I think it's how organisations view training as well. Are they viewing it as an overhead, or are they viewing it as an investment? And if we view it as an overhead, then absolutely budgets will get cut. If we view it as an investment and part and parcel of any other kind of investment in the organisation, then I think now is a fantastic time to do it. I think now is an absolutely great time to do it, and so that when we come out of this situation, we will come out of it, organisations will be stronger.
I think one of the other elements to this is how far we can also empower people to push forward in their own development. And one of the things that we've looked at in developing the new Projecting the Future paper was some of the thinking that's been going on around the kind of the skills policy system. One of the ideas that has been used in other parts of the world very effectively has been the emergence of individual training accounts, where people have got personal budgets for their own learning and development, so that they can, if they're in the 34% that I talked about who haven't had any formal training, or if they're in an organisation that doesn't see things as clearly as Ian sets out, or whatever the reasons are, they're out of work. If you have a personal budget that you can tap into to drive your own development, we are in a space where there are incredible options, be it through online programs or kind of more real world face-to-face programs as kind of society returns to some sort of normal. And so, we do need, I think, innovation on the skills policy sphere to respond to where we are already. And it's a difficult balancing act. APM has highlighted in its policy work that the policy world has been through incredible turmoil over the last 20, 30 years. Skills initiatives come, skills initiatives go, but I think clearly we need more change now to adapt not only to what's happening today, but these big long-term trends about automation and how people will survive and find some relevance in tomorrow's world.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of add into that, I really like that quote that Patrick put up from Friedman about the lifelong learning implication. I think there's always going to be a kind of a push from an organisation that they need skills to support the business, but I think there always needs to be a pull from the individual as well. There's so much out there for organisations and people to access that I think it's a mindset shift as well, away from just kind of what the needs of the business. How can I develop as an individual? How can I commit to that lifelong learning approach as well? And I think where the world is at the minute, with so much access to material, I mean, it's never been more easy to do that mindset shift as well.
Before we move on to the next question, if Alice is able to come in.
Very happy to be here and quickly go through this topic from a policy side of things. And I'm sure, as I was introduced earlier, I sort of represent the manufacturing sector. So I'm sort of looking at machining and manufacturing technology, which is a huge part of what the country does in terms of sort of digitization and the changes we're going through in this fourth industrial revolution. And just going back to a stat Ian showed when he was presenting, was that by 2030, there will be 21.2 million people underskilled with basic digital skills, which is incredibly worrying. As I'm sure we've all just gathered from this webinar this morning, this is what we need to keep up with the pace of emerging technologies. So coming from my sector, we're using so much new stuff like AI, virtual reality, 3D printing, the industrial Internet of Things, and robotics. And it's great that we're adapting all these, but at the end of the day, no one's trained to use them or to evolve with it. So this is our focus. Now, the skills gap we have now, very much exist, as we've seen today, but it's not going to be the same skills gap in 5 years' time. And no one has a crystal ball. We can't predict what it will be. But there's a lot we can do in terms of creating a dynamic policy that we can prepare ourselves to try and get as many people in the sector trained up, whether that's upskilling or retraining, whichever way it is. And it's all based on a bit of research that we've done, as well as the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, for DCMS. And so I think the first point I said was digital skills carry a wage differential. So roles requiring digital skills pay 29% more than those who do not. And this is apparent at all skill levels. And I think if you go from middle to high school, you can earn up to 11,000 more for that role. So it's obviously very relevant. And the demand everywhere. So I think the research showed that at least 82% of online jobs across the UK require digital skills. And that comes back to my point. So I'm very worried that 21 million people still won't have basic digital skills in the future with the same demand. And as I said, specific digital skills will help workers avoid the risk of automation, because if you have specific digital skills, you can work alongside the new machinery and increase career progression as well. And there's lots of things our sector use, such as AutoCAD and computer-aided design and things like that, which again isn't taught at schools, it's not taught in colleges, and the training's not there. So we need a digital skills policy, which we believe at MakeK should be driven locally, because digital skill requirements vary substantially from region to region, and so should efforts to train workers. And they will change over time, so that it should be the policy should be shaped to anticipate this dynamism. So you need to continue re-evaluate the skills that are and will be in demand to train workers for the skills of the future, whilst also ensuring they have the skills needed for success today. And I think government, alongside members organisations as myself, and employers can work together to do this. And I think, and another one of my favourite stats is that the adoption of digital technology could boost UK manufacturing by 455 billion over the next decade, which would increase sector growth up to 3% a year, and importantly, creating a net gain of 175,000 jobs. And that's just adopting more digital technology, which is great. So lots to do there. So a little bit about what the projects we're sort of doing this year is that we're getting lots of companies together to create trailblazer groups alongside government and ourselves to identify what skills we need in the next 5 years, what technologies are they using, and how can we get that training out to apprentices and those who are going to FE college. So sort of doing it from education upwards, which is very exciting. And I think that's the direction we're going in. So there's lots to be done. It's just getting on top of it and identifying the way forward.
Thanks, Els. I'm going to try and squeeze in one quick question before we do a quick sum up, and that's somebody's asked a really good question, which I think is very relevant to our profession. How do we manage and motivate multi-generational organisations, given there are an increasing diverse set of values amongst our workforce? Patrick, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, brilliant question. Well, I think one of the things that has been observed is that the differences between the generations are sometimes not quite as profound as some analysts seem to suggest. And actually, sometimes it distracts from the fact that all of our values and expectations of work are changing. I don't think that anyone goes to work today with the same expectations of hierarchy, command and control cultures that they might have had by comparison to their forebears sort of 20, 30, 40 years ago. So culture changes affect all of us. What we will see in some societies, of course, is that the makeup of our workforces changes. For Western societies in particular, we see populations becoming older on average. That means the 100-year life, as some commentators predict, or the 50-year career, if you want to think about it that way. And for organizations, yeah, you've got to rethink how you structure work. I think we need to get away from a view of careers that is linear, as I talked about, that only sees people going one way in terms of responsibility. We need to give much more flexibility over the course of careers and in late career stages where people might want to step down but still have an incredibly useful contribution to make. So how do we design jobs that can take account of the skills and experience that they have? How do we give people the performance feedback that they want, the opportunities to learn and grow? That is something that I think really resonates for younger generations coming in. So I think it's sort of a shift to a much more personalized approach. And one of the practical ways this can sometimes be done is something called job crafting, where development discussions become about how you can make small incremental tweaks to people's jobs to focus what people do so that they spend more time on the stuff that's their real strengths. And I think getting away from a kind of cookie cutter, one size fits all, any color as long as it's black mindset, it's long overdue, and that's the direction we have to go in.
Just to add on to that as well, there was a fantastic book, really fantastic book came out last year, back end of last year, called It's the Manager by Jim Clifton and Jim Harter, who from Gallup, kind of the research organization. And they talk about kind of the changing workplace, and they talk about that shift away from that kind of command and control to more of a kind of somebody being a coach and things like that. And one of the things they do talk about is that a lot of people, the senior shifter, a lot of people kind of come into work now for a sense of purpose. It's no longer just, just kind of get a paycheck, if you like. It's that sense of purpose. I'm a big fan of what Patrick just said about kind of it's no longer a kind of a career ladder. It's like a career matrix. So providing that philosophy of opportunity for people to develop and grow. And I think the workplace is changing, not just because of technology. I think that's the catalyst for change, but I think expectations are very different. I think for me, the big thing is the cultural shift for organizations to make sure that people have got a purpose now rather than just a paycheck.
Thanks. Alice, one quick last word before we do a quick sum up.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Really interesting stuff from every today, and changes need to happen. I think embracing a new digital world is happening faster than we thought, perhaps because of COVID-19. We were forced to work remotely, but I think everyone started to wake up to the fact that we need to move now or we're left behind, and we don't have that innovation that this country desperately needs. And that starts with upskilling and retraining our existing workforce, because our aging workforce is disappearing in the next 3 years. So that's my final word. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for coming on the webinar. Please keep your contributions and your thoughts coming on the website. Keep the debate going. We will look at all the questions and the contributions and feed them into the next stage of the process, because we want APM to be able to sort of basically crowdsource all your thoughts and thinking. So thanks for taking part, thanks for listening, and thanks in particular to Patrick, Ian and Alice for their excellent contributions. Keep engaged. We'll leave you with the slides saying how you can get engaged: LinkedIn, Twitter, online, email us. Thanks everybody for joining us.